Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how certain movements manage to convince so many people to join their cause, especially during times of big change and uncertainty, like a pandemic? Well, this new study dives deep into exactly that. Imagine a world where everything you knew about daily life suddenly changed. That was the COVID-19 pandemic. We were suddenly bombarded with new scientific terms and asked to do things like stay home and wear masks, all of which felt very strange and new. So, how did people make sense of this weird new world? And why did some people push back so hard against the official advice? That is the central question this research tackles. This paper looks at the Covid-sceptic movement in the UK and how they got people on board with their ideas. They're not just looking at individual thoughts, but more at how groups of people understand the world together, especially when things get confusing. They use some really interesting psychology ideas to explain this, like how we create shared understandings, how we see ourselves as part of groups, and how leaders can get people to act. Think about how we make sense of new things. The idea here is that we don't just figure things out on our own. Instead, we familiarize new and strange ideas by comparing them to things we already know and understand from our culture. This process, called social representations, helps us make sense of the world, and importantly, it often involves talking and debating with others. Two key ways this happens are through anchoring and objectification. Anchoring is like fitting a new idea into a familiar box. For example, if a new virus appears, we might anchor it by comparing it to past flu seasons. Objectification is making abstract ideas concrete. Think of how we might represent the idea of freedom with a flag or an eagle. It makes the idea more real and easier to grasp. This theory is super helpful because it is designed to explain how we, as a society, come to understand new and complex things, especially when they arise from science or major events. It is not just about individual brains working, but about collective understanding. Then there is the social identity approach. This idea says that how we see ourselves is deeply tied to the groups we belong to. Our sense of us versus them is a huge driver of our behavior. The researchers here believe that social representations and social identities are super connected. To understand the world and form an identity are almost the same thing. This is a really important point. When we create these shared understandings, these social representations, it is not just about understanding. It is also about mobilizing people and creating groups that can then act to change things. For example, framing immigration as a threat can mobilize a nationalist group. So it is not just about passively perceiving the world, but actively being brought to see it in a certain way. This is where leadership comes in. Leaders can frame the world to encourage specific actions and beliefs. This is the core of identity leadership. Leaders aren't just bosses. They present themselves as one of us, as embodying the group's identity, and therefore their ideas should be seen as representing the group's best interests. Now, how did this apply to the Covid-sceptic movement in the UK? The researchers used this framework to analyze speeches, campaign materials, and protests from this group. First, they had to gather their data. The Covid-sceptic movement wasn't one big group, but many smaller ones. They collected materials like newsletters, leaflets, short videos, and recorded speeches from rallies between April and December 2020. They focused on these materials because they were used to persuade and get people involved. Their method for analyzing all this material was called a structural analysis of group arguments, or SAGA. It is a way to carefully look at the language used to understand the social categories people are talking about, like us and them, and how those categories relate to each other. Their first big question was pretty direct. Did the Covid-sceptic movement talk about the pandemic using populist ideas, dividing people into the people and the elite? And the answer to that first question is a huge yes. They found that the movement consistently framed the pandemic as a tool of control. They used strong images like a boot stamping on a face to show this. Speakers at rallies talked about fighting for freedom and explicitly identified themselves as the people, or the 99% against an unnamed elite, who were to blame for what was happening. They clearly saw a conflict between the people and the elite. The elite were presented as exploiting people and trying to sell the country off. This populist framing was central to how they talked about the pandemic. So, they established that the movement used populist categories. The next big question was, who exactly are the people and who are the elite in this framing? The people were largely defined in national terms. They used references to British history, like Winston Churchill's speeches, to evoke a sense of national identity and pride. They presented themselves as defenders of Britain, fighting against oppressive measures. Interestingly, there were also hints of an ethnic definition of nationhood. One newsletter contrasted encouragement for Black Lives Matter protests with the handling of lockdown protesters, suggesting that some groups, even if they have British citizenship, might not be considered the people. The elite, on the other hand, were described in a more fuzzy and widespread way. They were often portrayed as a global group with a hidden agenda. Common themes included New World Order conspiracies, suggesting a powerful, shadowy group pulling the strings. Specific groups accused of being part of this elite included billionaires like Bill Gates, governments, scientists, and doctors, and the media. The idea was that these groups were all connected and working together. Bill Gates was a prominent target, with claims that his support for vaccines was part of a larger plan for global control and the implementation of digital IDs. The government was portrayed as deliberately trying to destroy small businesses, not because of the virus, but for some other hidden reason. Even trusted institutions like the NHS were sometimes framed as propaganda arms of the government. Scientists and medical professionals were accused of pushing official narratives for political reasons, even censoring research that didn't fit. The key message was that these measures weren't about health, but about control. This brings us to the third question: how did they characterize the relationship between the elite and the people, and what did this mean for how people should act? The core of the relationship was control. Measures like mask mandates were presented not as health precautions, but as symbols of suppression and dehumanization. They used powerful imagery, like depicting masks as muzzles or strings held by a puppeteer, to make the abstract idea of control very concrete and visual. Vaccines were also objectified as tools of control and repression, linked to dangerous historical events and sinister agendas like mind control and reducing fertility. Piers Corbyn, a prominent figure, even compared vaccine promotion to rhetoric used in Nazi death camps, powerfully anchoring opposition to vaccines in a familiar historical narrative of tyranny. The implication for how people should respond was clear: resist. They were encouraged to believe that adherence to measures meant betraying their freedom and their nation. Even those working within institutions like the NHS were portrayed as afraid or complicit, fueling anger and distrust. The overall picture emerging was that the elite were seen as an enemy actively trying to dominate, control, and exploit the people. The specific method of control, whether it was masks, vaccines, or lockdowns, was less important than the underlying pattern of control itself. What is really interesting is that this study confirms their earlier findings. They previously found that people who believed in the people versus elite worldview had less trust in scientists and were less likely to follow COVID rules. This current research shows how the Covid-sceptic movement actively promoted this populist framing to mobilize opposition. The researchers highlight that the UK had a history of populist movements like Brexit, which provided fertile ground for these anti-elite and nationalist narratives to take hold during the pandemic. It shows how existing ways of talking about us and thems can be quickly adapted during new crises. They argue that populism isn't so much a specific set of ideas, but a mobilization tool. Its power comes from its flexibility. It can unite people against a perceived oppressor by creating a strong moral divide without needing to define exactly who belongs to each side very rigidly. This openness allows it to adapt to different situations and attract a wider range of people. So, what does this all mean for us? This research shows that during times of intense uncertainty, like a pandemic, populist framing can be incredibly effective for mobilizing people. It provides a narrative that makes sense of confusing events by identifying clear villains and heroes, even if those labels are fluid. The study strongly suggests that understanding and responding to major events like pandemics is a collective process. It is not just about individual thinking, but about how groups, influenced by leaders and existing cultural narratives, make sense of the world together. Of course, this study focused on the UK in 2020. It's a snapshot in time. The ways these ideas were expressed and the groups involved might have changed over time, and importantly, similar dynamics were happening in many other countries. Future research could definitely explore how these populist narratives traveled and transformed across borders. What is fascinating is how adaptable populism is. It is a powerful tool for making sense of chaotic times, and this study shows that it is likely to keep showing up in future crises. Understanding these patterns of mobilization and sense making is crucial for navigating an uncertain world and for developing effective counter-strategies. So, what do you think? Have you seen these populist dynamics play out in other situations? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the fascinating world of psychology and human behavior. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.